Having knowledge of the biochemical and physiological principles of nutrition can be helpful in devising strategies for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of various diseases of animals. But this knowledge doesn't lead automatically to the practical process of creating diets for dogs and cats. The nutritional health of dogs and cats has improved tremendously since the state of 50 or 60 years ago because of the availability of commercial food. Having knowledge of the biochemical and physiological principles of nutrition can be helpful in devising strategies for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of various diseases of animals. But this knowledge doesn't lead automatically to the practical process of creating diets for dogs and cats. The nutritional health of dogs and cats has improved tremendously since the state of 50 or 60 years ago because of the availability of commercial foods that have been formulated to meet exactly the nutritional requirements of these animals. Nevertheless, some pet owners, for a variety of reasons, would like to be able to make diets for their own dog or cat from foods that are commonly available in the domestic kitchen. It is therefore possible that cases of malnutrition might reappear because the diets being fed to these animals are not nutritionally sound. Inevitably, in creating diets that meet nutritional requirements, some numerical information is required. This can be a bit off-putting, but I am hoping to show how you, as an expert, can use numerical information in creating a diet so that you can simplify this when advising pet owners on feeding their dog or cat. This talk aims at showing how you can use nutritional principles to formulate diets for feeding dogs and cats. Once you have created a basic diet for dogs and cats, pet owners could modify this according to preference and food availability with the confidence that the diet would actually meet the nutritional needs of their animal. So, what are the nutritional principles that we need to consider when creating a recipe for a diet for a dog or cat? There are 4 things that one has to bear in mind. The first is that the diet should contain all of the nutrients which a dog or cat requires each day in the quantity of food that the animal is physically able to eat each day. Secondly, the foods that are used to make a diet should be appropriate for the alimentary tract of the animal. That is, the food should be able to be digested and the end products of digestion absorbed during the time that the food passes through the alimentary tract. Thirdly, the diet needs to be palatable. If the diet is nutritionally perfect for it to meet the nutritional requirements of a dog or cat, but the dog or cat won't eat it, then it's not going to be very helpful. And fourthly, because some pet owners want to make their own diet because they need to save money, the ingredients for the diet should not be expensive. So what would be the best way to advise a pet owner? Perhaps a way of doing this would be to create a basic recipe that could then be modified by the animal owner by varying the ingredients. So what information would be needed to devise a basic recipe? There are two sorts of information that are needed. First, the requirements of each nutrient each day for dogs and for cats. And secondly, related to the food, what is the nutritional content of each of the foods that might be used in creating a recipe? Whereabouts could I find this information? Well, the nutrient requirements are very cleverly and clearly defined in a book produced by the National Research Council of the United States, The Nutrient Requirements of Dogs and Cats. This is a compilation of all the information that is available about the nutrient requirements of these animals in different stages of their lives. What about the information about food composition? The nutrient content of food is readily available in an online database called OSNUT 2011 to 2013. This online free database is produced by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, the government agency which is concerned with the standardisation of information about food. And it contains the nutrient content of 5,740 different foods, and is a wealth of information that could be used when creating a diet for dogs or cats. It's available online at this website, but you can readily find it by just simply doing a search for the term OSNUT. What are the nutrients that we need to consider when formulating a diet for dogs and for cats? Well, the first and the most important nutrient that we need to consider is the chemical energy that the animal is going to get from food. This is defined as metabolizable energy. That is the quantity of chemical energy that the animal actually gets from food after the absorption of the digested end products. It is somewhat less than the gross energy of food because some of the energy is not digested, and also some of it is lost in urine. So we don't really know the metabolizable energy, although we can do calculations based upon experimental evidence from different compositions of foods. However, the gross energy of food is given in the database, and so that is a reasonable guide when we're working out whether the food is going to contain all the chemical energy that needs to meet the energy requirements of a dog or cat. Metabolizable energy is provided by three components of food, provided by carbohydrate, protein, and fat. The second nutrient that we need to consider is protein. Protein is used as a source of energy by these animals, particularly for cats. It is also, of course, required to supply the amino acids for the animals synthesizing its own protein. And thirdly, some of the amino acids are used to make some hormones, such as serotonin is made from tryptophan and thyroid hormone is made from tyrosine. The third nutrient that we need to consider is fat. Fat is used for energy. It contains almost 2.5 times the energy content of carbohydrate and of protein. Some fatty acids in fat are essential nutrients because they are the precursors of the eicosanoid hormones, such as prostaglandins, prostacyclins. And dietary fat is also needed to be able to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. A diet might have adequate amounts of these vitamins, but if there isn't enough fat, they won't be absorbed. And the fourth major group of nutrients are the micronutrients, so-called because they're required in much smaller amounts, but they're still very important components of a diet. These are the water-soluble vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, and the inorganic or mineral elements. So what food ingredients could we use in order to make a recipe that is going to provide adequate amounts of these particular range of nutrients? Cats are obligate carnivores. That means that they are able to obtain all of their nutritional requirements from the carcasses of the animals that they kill in the wild. Dogs are also carnivores, but they have been modified over the time when they have been domesticated and are capable of obtaining nutrients from a wider range of different foods. Because these animals are carnivore, meat will be the main component of their diets in the wild, and this is a helpful way of thinking about building a recipe for these animals. What is the composition of meat? So if we look at the components of meat per 100 grams, let's take these ones that I've been talking about: gross energy, protein, and fat. There's also going to be a small amount of inorganic material, and of course, there's a large amount of water. So let's take a typical meat, which is raw beef. You can see that it contains 555 kilojoules of gross energy per 100 grams. Most of this is being produced from protein, which contains 27.6 grams per 100 grams. There is a small amount of fat, approximately 2%, and a small amount of inorganic material, about 1%. But the main component of meat is, of course, water. Around about 70% of the total weight of raw meat is water. What about cooked meat? Stewed beef, for example, contains a similar proportion of all of these components, except that the water content has gone down. As a result, the density of all these other components of meat have increased slightly. Now, I've been talking about beef. What about other forms of meat? Well, if you take stewed lamb or stewed mutton, you can see that its composition is not very different from that of stewed beef. And this applies really to all of the different types of meat that would be available. So we can use, for example, the composition of stewed beef as being fairly typical of all of the meats that might be used in a recipe. What about the vitamins in stewed meat? Well, these are the vitamins, the water-soluble vitamins, and you can see that there are small amounts of all of them. This is not going to be a major source of the vitamins, but it is nevertheless a useful source of these vitamins. The fat-soluble vitamins are also present in quite small amounts. However, vitamin D in particular is probably going to be the most useful vitamin to be obtained from meat. It is not present in nearly all other foods that might be used in a diet, and so meat is going to be a useful source of vitamin D to dogs and cats that are unable to make their own vitamin D by exposing their skin to the sun in the way that we as humans are able to obtain vitamin D. What about the inorganic micronutrients? Well, they are all present in meat. However, there's one particular set of micronutrients that need to be concerned. That is the calcium content and the phosphorus content. You can see that the calcium content is really very much lower than the phosphorus content, and I'll draw particular attention to that later in this talk. In order to make sure that all of the ingredients in a diet are going to provide all the micronutrients required, it's desirable to have a micronutrient supplement food. The best natural source of these would be lightly cooked liver. Some people may object to liver as being an ingredient of the diet of dogs because of the risk of that it contains hydatid cysts that can be transmitted to the dog. However, if the liver has been approved for human consumption, and if it has been cooked in order to destroy any hydatid cysts that are present, then it is a reasonable source of some of the micronutrients. The main nutrients, energy, protein, and fat in liver are not too dissimilar from that of the skeletal muscle meat. Most of the energy is going to be provided again by protein, but the fat content of liver is somewhat higher than that of meat, skeletal muscle, and of course there is some glycogen in liver, which is very much higher than that in muscle. And again, water is the main component, representing around about 60% of the total weight of the liver. The inorganic micronutrients are also present in small amounts in liver as they are in meat. And again, note that the calcium content is very much lower than the phosphorus content. What about the vitamins? This would be the reason why you would be suggesting that liver is included in a recipe for a diet of dogs and cats. These are the vitamins that are present in liver, and a particularly important source of a vitamin is going to be vitamin A. If you compare the vitamin content of liver compared to that of meat, you can see that liver has a much richer range of vitamins than the meat does. And so liver is a very good source of all of these vitamins. And if it is incorporated into a diet for dogs and cats, then you can be fairly confident that their vitamin requirements are going to be met. However, in order to make the diet relatively cheap, it would be a good idea to include a source of energy that is cheaper than the other ingredients that we've considered so far. And one of those is boiled potato. Although dogs and cats are carnivores, surprisingly, they are able to digest starch in their alimentary tract and absorb the glucose that is produced. However, the starch needs to be treated before it is eaten by heating and making the digestion of the starch more readily. So these are the main nutrients that are present in boiled potato. So again, you can see that the main source of the energy is going to be starch. There is a very small amount of fat, and there's not much else present in potato except, of course, water, which represents around about 80% of the total weight of the potato. What about the micronutrients? Well, the vitamins, there are traces of them present in potato, but this wouldn't be seen as a reasonably good source of these micronutrients. Likewise, the inorganic nutrients are also present in potato, but again notice that the calcium content is very much lower than the phosphorus content. Another component that could be used in the diet is a source of dietary fat. This is going to be a concentrated source of energy, and dogs and cats are certainly able to utilize quite large amounts of fat in their diet. So if we take a typical vegetable oil such as corn oil, you can see that 100 grams of that oil contains a considerably higher quantity of gross energy than 100 grams of the other foods that we have been considering. Another advantage of a vegetable oil in the diet is that it contains vitamin E. So this would be a useful source of vitamin E to be including in the diet of dogs and cats. So we now have some basic ingredients to construct a diet for a dog or a cat. We have meat, liver, potato, and a vegetable oil. Meat is going to supply energy, it's going to supply protein, and it's going to supply some of the micronutrients. Liver is going to supply energy and protein and lots of the vitamins. Potato is going to supply energy, and vegetable oil is going to supply energy and is a good source of vitamin E. However, there is one big nutritional problem which needs to be addressed in creating a diet for dogs and cats. That is the calcium to phosphorus ratio in the food. If you look at the calcium to phosphorus ratio in the 3 foods that I've been considering that could be used in a diet for dogs and cats, you can see that it is very low. The calcium phosphorus ratio in the diets for dogs and cats should be somewhere between 1:1 to 2:1. That is 1 gram of calcium to 1 gram of phosphorus, up to 2 grams of calcium to 1 gram of phosphorus. And these foods are really very low in this particular ratio. So we need to have a calcium and phosphorus supplement in order to correct this deficiency in the diet if we're going to use these foods. Dibasic calcium phosphate is one source that could be used to give adequate amounts of calcium and phosphorus. It is commonly known as DiCal, and it has a calcium-phosphorus ratio of 1.3, that is 1.3 grams of calcium to 1 gram of phosphorus. Another source of calcium and phosphorus is hydroxyapatite, the mineral that makes up bone. It has a calcium-phosphorus ratio of 2.1 to 1, 2.1 grams of calcium to 1 gram of phosphorus, and it is present in bone meal. Now, bone meal used to be very readily available, but in the 1990s, because of the appearance of bovine spongiform encephalopathy and the risk of transmitting the prions of this disease, bone meal became much more difficult to find. However, it can be purchased. It is present. It can be found from a variety of sources. And it can also be made by simply boiling bone and then pulverizing it into finely divided pieces. So what about the nutrient requirements of the animal? When you're constructing a diet, the first and the main nutrient that you need to consider is going to be energy. And the United States National Research Council has produced an equation to give a guide as to how much energy should be provided based upon the weight of an adult animal. And that equation is 125 times the body weight in kilograms to the power of 0.75. That unit of body weight in kilograms to the power of 0.75 is known as the metabolic body weight, and it represents the proportion of the total body weight that is actually going to be using energy. The units that the equation uses are in calories. Now, it's really only the United States that uses calories to define the energy content of foods. So we really need to convert that into the unit that is now used elsewhere, particularly in Australia, which is the joule. So how much energy would a 15 kilogram dog require? Using this equation, it would be 125 times 15 to the power of 0.75 kilocalories per day. That converts to 125 times 7.6, which is 950 kilocalories per day. If we convert that to joules, 1 calorie is equal to 4.184 joules. So therefore, to convert 950 kilocalories to kilojoules, we just multiply 950 by 4.184, and that gives us a value of 3,975 kilojoules per day. Now, this is the metabolizable energy, but we don't have that value for the foods that we are going to be using. So we're going to work on the basis of gross energy content in kilojoules. And this is going to be an approximation because the animal may in fact require somewhat more food than we are calculating, simply because the metabolizable energy is less than the gross energy in a food. So let's now create a diet for a dog. We need to make a mixture of food, first of all, to meet the energy requirements. Most of the mass of a diet is going to be providing energy. And we've got the ingredients that we've been talking about: stewed beef, cooked liver, cooked potato, corn oil, bone meal, and we need to add some sodium chloride in order to meet the minimum requirements for sodium in the diet. If we look at the gross energy in 100 grams of each of these foods that are going to provide energy, these are the amounts that have been defined in the OSNUT database. So now let's create a diet. This is really a matter of guesswork to start with. Since meat is going to be the most significant component in the diet of a dog or cat, we need to think about how much we should be using. And as a guess, I would say around about a third of the weight. So if we're going to make a kilogram of diet, I'd suggest something like 350 grams of stewed beef could be the start of the recipe. Now we need to add some liver in order to supply the vitamins. And again, I think around about 10% of the diet, say 80 grams, might be a good way to start. Now, because we're going to make this diet as inexpensive as possible, we want to include a goodly amount of potato, say 50% potato, 525 grams. Corn oil, how about 20 grams of corn oil to make sure that there's enough fat in the diet along with that which is present in the meat and the liver to be able to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. Bone meal, 20 grams of bone meal will certainly provide sufficient calcium and phosphorus to override the wrong ratio that is present in the other ingredients. And say a teaspoon of salt, 5 grams, to make up the total weight of 1 kilogram. Now, what does this diet contain in terms of energy? When we add up all the energy component in these quantities of ingredients, it comes to 5,250 kilojoules per 1,000 grams per kilogram. So how much of this mixture would we need to supply for a dog weighing 15 kilograms? We've estimated the metabolizable energy of a 15 kilogram dog is 3,975 kilojoules. If we're just going to use the gross energy of the diet, which contains 5,250 kilojoules in a kilogram, then the amount of this food that we need to supply this 15 kilogram dog is 3,975 multiplied by 1,000 divided by 5,250, which comes to 760 grams per day. Because this diet contains 69.5% water, the amount of dry matter that's present in 760 grams is only 232 grams. Now, if you were feeding this diet to a 15 kilogram dog, you might find that it is putting on weight if it is providing too much energy, or in fact, it is perpetually hungry and is losing weight because the amount of food that you're providing does not supply enough energy. So in order to ensure that the diet is meeting the energy requirements for any particular animal, it is wise to be able to weigh it at relatively frequent intervals when you're introducing a diet like this. What about the protein content of the mixture? These are the components of this draft diet, and this is the protein content of the components that are going to be providing protein. This is the recipe that we have created, and the total amount of protein in that recipe would be 153 grams per 1,000 grams, 153 grams per kilogram of total diet. Is this going to be enough? Well, the National Research Council says that the minimum protein requirement for an adult dog is 51.4 grams per 1,000 kilocalories, or per 4,184 kilojoules. We know that there is 153 grams per 5,250 kilojoules in this draft diet, which turns out to be 122 grams per 4,184 kilojoules. So this diet contains more than twice the minimum for an adult dog. So it's going to meet the protein requirement. What about the fat content? The fat content is 41.7 grams per kilogram of diet. Is that going to be enough? The minimum fat for an adult dog, according to the National Research Council, is 14.2 grams per 4,184 kilojoules. The fat in the diet is 41.7 grams per 5,250 kilojoules, which turns out to be 33 grams per 4,184 kilojoules. So again, there is twice as much fat in this diet as the minimum requirements. So how much of this diet would we need to feed to animals of different weight, dogs of different weight, from 5, say, to 30 kilograms, just using the requirements based upon a kilojoule of metabolizable energy per day and using the gross energy of the food as a guide. And so you can see that there is an increasing weight of this food as the animal's body weight increases and the dry matter increases. This is going to be a guide, but as a way of advising pet owners, it is a reasonable guide. What about formulating a diet for a cat? There are two particular differences in the nutritional requirements that cats have compared with dogs. One is they have a higher protein requirement. The reason for this is because they use a significant proportion of their dietary protein, or the amino acids derived from their dietary protein, as a source of energy. And this is going to remove a lot of the amino acids that could be used for other purposes. So in order to meet the protein requirements for all its requirements in a cat, we need to ensure that the diet fed to cats is going to have a higher protein requirement than the diet fed to dogs. They also have a range of special micronutrient requirements that are much more fastidious than the micronutrient requirements for dogs. So we need to consider these two special requirements of cats in formulating a diet for them. The nutrient requirements in terms of energy for cats is more simply defined by the National Research Council. It says that 50 to 70 kilocalories of metabolizable energy are required per kilogram body weight of a cat per day. If the cat is very active, very physically active, then it probably will require closer to 70 kilocalories of metabolizable energy per kilogram. And if it is a relatively sedentary cat, then it will probably require less, towards 50 kilocalories of metabolizable energy per kilogram body weight per day. So how much energy would a 4-kilogram cat require? If we say it is an active 4-kilogram cat, it will require 70 times 4 kilocalories of metabolizable energy per day. That's 280 kilocalories per day. And converting that into kilojoules, that becomes 1,172 kilojoules of metabolizable energy per day. So using the gross energy as a guide to the use of energy in foods, we need to make a mix of food to meet the energy and the protein requirements for a cat diet. So these are the ingredients that we've used before. And this is the food quantity that we use for a dog. So we want to increase the protein content for a cat, and we want to make sure that all of the micronutrients are going to be supplied in adequate amounts for the cat. So let's take a guess at how we might use these ingredients. Let's use about twice as much meat, say 600 grams of stewed beef, in order to increase the protein content of the diet for a cat. And in order to make sure that all of the micronutrients are met, let's add, say, 100 grams of liver, cooked liver, in order to meet the micronutrient requirements. And because we're going to supply more of the energy from the beef and the liver, we only need to use around about 25% of a kilogram of diet as cooked potato. We can probably increase the amount of oil in the diet because cats have an incredible ability to digest and absorb the fatty acids from oil. We can probably keep the bone meal and the salt content the same as for the diet for a dog, and this makes up a kilogram of the mixture. What is the energy and the protein content of this mixture, this draft diet for a cat? So this is the draft diet that we have dreamt up, and this is the gross energy content. So you can see it has a higher gross energy content than the comparable diet that we created for a dog. And this is the total protein content in this diet. So how much of this mixture would we feed to a 4-kilogram cat? The equation says that a 4-kilogram cat requires 1,172 kilojoules. The gross energy of the food, this recipe that we've just constructed, is 6,786 kilojoules per kilogram. So therefore, we would need to supply 173 grams of this food for the 4-kilogram cat. The water content of this diet is 70%, and so the dry matter that the cat would be eating each day would be 52 grams. This is again assuming that the gross energy is the same as the metabolizable energy, and we know that the metabolizable energy is less than the gross energy, so we may have to feed somewhat more of this diet in order to ensure that the cat's energy requirements are being met. The protein content of this diet is 245 grams per kilogram. Is that going to be enough? Well, the minimum protein for an adult cat, according to the NRC requirements, is 26 grams per 100 grams of dry matter. Protein in the diet is 245 grams per kilogram, which is 245 grams per 300 grams of dry matter. This works out at 82 grams of protein per 100 grams of dry matter, at least 3 times above the minimum protein requirement. So it's going to meet the protein requirement. What is the approximate amount of this diet for cats of different body weights? The diet contains 6,786 kilojoules of gross energy. This is the amount of metabolizable energy that cats might require per day. And this is the amount of food using the gross energy as a guide to supply the possible metabolizable energy that the cat will actually require. And this is the dry matter which is present in the food. Well, that is an overview of how you, with good nutritional knowledge, could construct a basic diet that would meet the needs of an adult dog or an adult cat according to their body weight. Of course, if the diet is required for growing animals or for pregnant or lactating animals, changes would need to be made according to their special requirements, as defined in the nutritional literature. The basic mixture is merely an example of how commonly available foods can be used in a mixture to meet all the nutritional needs of dogs or cats. It could be modified with the use of other ingredients, but the important thing to remember is that the diet should provide enough energy, protein, fat, and all the micronutrients that these animals need on a daily basis, paying particular attention, of course, to the quantity of calcium and phosphorus and their ratio in the diet. You may well have many questions, suggestions, or even challenges about the information I have provided in this talk. I'd be very happy to answer those questions or to comment on anything that you would like to raise in the days ahead.